The train whistle echoed across the snow-covered Colorado mountains as Margaret O'Brien stepped onto the platform at Pine Ridge Station, her heart pounding with equal parts hope and terror. At 28, she was heavier than most women, with curves that strained against her blue traveling dress and a face that carried the soft beauty of Irish countryside. She clutched a worn letter in her gloved hand, the letter that had brought her across an ocean and half a continent to marry a man she'd never met. Sheriff Cole Davidson was supposed to be waiting for her. Instead, she found herself standing alone on the platform while curious townspeople gathered like vultures, their whispers cutting through the winter air like knives. "That can't be her," someone muttered. "Cole's expecting a bride, not a barn. Poor man probably thought he was getting something different from that photograph. Look at the size of her. How's she even going to fit through a church door?" The laughter that followed was cruel and sharp, and Margaret felt her cheeks burn with shame. She'd known this moment would come. It always did. But she'd hoped, foolishly perhaps, that here in the frontier where survival mattered more than appearance, things might be different. They weren't. Sheriff Cole Davidson finally appeared, tall and broad-shouldered with a star pinned to his coat and worry lines etched deep around his eyes. He was handsome in the way that Western men often were, weathered by sun and hardship, but strong. His gaze found her immediately, and she saw something flicker across his face. Disappointment? Regret? She couldn't be sure, but it made her stomach clench with familiar dread. "Miss O'Brien," his voice was carefully neutral, the kind of politeness that masked deeper feelings. "Yes, Sheriff Davidson, though I suspect you're wishing I wasn't." Margaret lifted her chin, refusing to let the town's cruelty break her before she'd even had a chance to try. But what Cole Davidson couldn't have predicted was the small hand that slipped into his, and the bright voice that cut through the winter silence like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. "Papa, she's beautiful." 6-year-old Emma Davidson had appeared at her father's side, her blonde curls peeking out from under her woolen cap, her blue eyes wide with genuine admiration as she stared up at Margaret. The child's words rang across the platform, clear and innocent and utterly sincere. The crowd fell silent. Emma let go of her father's hand and walked straight to Margaret, unafraid and unburdened by the prejudices that poisoned adult hearts. "You look like the lady in my storybook," she said, reaching up to touch the blue fabric of Margaret's dress. "The one who married the prince and lived in a castle." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, not from shame this time, but from something far more powerful. She knelt down to Emma's level, her voice soft with wonder. "Do I really look like a princess to you, sweetheart?" "The prettiest princess ever," Emma declared with the absolute certainty that only children possess. "Papa, isn't she beautiful?" Cole Davidson looked down at his daughter, then at the woman who'd traveled so far to become his wife, and something shifted in his chest. Through Emma's eyes, he saw not Margaret's size, but her gentle grace, the kindness in her green eyes, the courage it had taken to come so far for love. The townspeople were still watching, still waiting to see what would happen next. Some looked ashamed of their earlier cruelty, others remained skeptical, but none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was the child who saw beauty where others saw flaws, and the father who was finally learning to see through his daughter's eyes. What happened next would change not just 3 lives, but an entire town's understanding of what it truly meant to be beautiful. The silence that followed Emma's declaration stretched like a held breath across the snow-covered platform. Margaret O'Brien remained kneeling in the slush, this innocent child's hands now resting gently on her shoulders, while dozens of eyes bore into her from every direction. Some of those gazes had shifted from cruel amusement to something resembling shame, but others remained hard and judgmental. Sheriff Cole Davidson stood frozen, his daughter's words echoing in his mind. "Papa, isn't she beautiful?" When was the last time Emma had spoken with such genuine enthusiasm about anything? Since her mother's death 2 years ago, his little girl had become quiet, withdrawn, speaking only when necessary. But here she was, animated and joyful, defending a stranger with the fierce loyalty of a knight protecting a queen. "Emma," Cole said quietly, his voice rougher than he'd intended, "come away from the lady. Let her get her bearings. But Emma didn't budge. Instead, she wrapped her small arms around Margaret's neck in an impromptu hug that made the Irish woman's breath catch. "Don't listen to them," Emma whispered, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "They're just being mean because they forgot how to see pretty things." Margaret's eyes welled with tears she'd been holding back since the moment she'd stepped off that train. In all her 28 years, through all the mockery and rejection she'd endured, no one had ever defended her with such pure, uncomplicated love. This child barely knew her, yet Emma was willing to stand between her and the world's cruelty. "Thank you, little angel," Margaret whispered back, her Irish accent thick with emotion. "You have the kindest heart I've ever known." Dr. Henley, the town physician, cleared his throat uncomfortably. He was one of the men who'd been laughing moments before, and now his weathered face showed signs of regret. "Cole, perhaps we should let the lady get settled. It's cold enough to freeze a man's conscience out here." The words were clearly an attempt at making amends, but they fell flat in the tense atmosphere. Cole nodded curtly and moved to help Margaret to her feet. When his gloved hand touched hers, she looked up at him with those remarkable green eyes, and for a moment, he forgot about everything else. She was beautiful, not in the way his late wife Sarah had been, delicate and bird-like, but beautiful in a way that spoke of strength and warmth and life. Her face was round and soft, with creamy skin touched pink by the cold, and her auburn hair caught the winter sunlight like burnished copper. But it was her eyes that truly caught him, intelligent, kind, and utterly without malice despite the treatment she just received. "Can you stand?" he asked, his voice gentler now. "I can manage, thank you." Margaret rose with surprising grace for a woman of her size, brushing snow from her blue dress with practiced dignity. "Though I confess, Sheriff Davidson, this wasn't quite the welcome I'd imagined." Emma tugged at her father's coat. "Papa, why were those people saying mean things?" "She's pretty like Mama was pretty, just bigger pretty." The comparison to Sarah hit Cole like a physical blow, but not in the way he'd expected. Emma had rarely spoken about her mother since the fever took her, and never did compare anyone else to Sarah's memory. Yet here she was, not replacing her mother in her affections, but making room for someone new. "Sometimes, little bird, grown-ups forget how to see with their hearts instead of just their eyes," Cole said, lifting Emma into his arms. He looked at Margaret over his daughter's head. "I apologize for the town's poor manners, Miss O'Brien. Pine Ridge isn't usually so unwelcoming." Margaret's smile was sad but not bitter. "I've learned not to expect warm reception, Sheriff." "But your daughter," she reached out to gently touch Emma's mittened hand, "your daughter sees the world the way God intended it to be seen." They were interrupted by the approach of Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife and self-appointed guardian of the town's moral standards. She was a thin, sharp-featured woman who wore her disapproval like a badge of honor. "Sheriff Davidson," she said in her clipped, proper voice, "I trust you'll be making suitable arrangements for this situation." Her gaze swept over Margaret with barely concealed disdain. "We can't have unseemly disruptions to the town's peace." Emma twisted in her father's arms to face Mrs. Abernathy. "What's unseemly mean?" "It means improper, dear," Mrs. Abernathy replied with false sweetness, "when things don't match what decent people expect." "Oh." Emma considered this seriously, then turned back to Margaret. "Are you improper?" Margaret had to swallow hard before she could answer. "Some people think so, sweetheart. But I try to be kind and honest and helpful." "I hope that's proper enough." "It is," Emma declared firmly, then fixed Mrs. Abernathy with a stare that was remarkably adult for a 6-year-old. "My mama always said being kind is the most proper thing anyone can be. So if you're not being kind, then you're the one being improper." Mrs. Abernathy's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. Several men in the crowd chuckled, and even Doc Henley was trying to hide a smile behind his hand. Cole felt a surge of pride in his daughter that nearly overwhelmed him. "Emma's right," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his badge. "Kindness is proper. Cruelty isn't. I think some folks here forgot that for a moment." The crowd began to disperse, some looking ashamed, others grumbling under their breath. Mrs. Abernathy huffed and stalked away, her bustle swaying with indignation. Soon only Cole, Emma, and Margaret remained on the platform with Margaret's single battered trunk. "So," Cole said awkwardly, setting Emma down, "I suppose we should discuss arrangements." Margaret nodded, pulling her coat tighter against the cold. "I understand if you've changed your mind, Sheriff. The letters we exchanged, well, I wasn't entirely forthcoming about my appearance. You have every right to send me back to Ireland." "No!" Emma's protest was immediate and fierce. "She can't go back. She just got here, and she's nice, and she smells like flowers, and she has the prettiest dress I ever saw." Cole looked down at his daughter's distressed face, then back at Margaret's carefully composed one. He thought about the letters they'd exchanged over 6 months, letters full of intelligence and humor and kindness. Letters that had made him laugh for the first time since Sarah's death. Letters that had given him hope that maybe, just maybe, he could build a life with someone again. Had her appearance in those letters been misleading? Yes. But then again, he hadn't been entirely honest either. He'd failed to mention how the town could be cruel to outsiders, how some people measured worth by appearances alone, how difficult it would be for any woman to step into Sarah's place in their lives. "Miss O'Brien," he said finally, "I'd like to propose something." Margaret tensed, clearly expecting rejection. "Give us a week," Cole continued. "Stay at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. Let Emma get to know you properly. Let me get to know you properly. Then we'll decide together if this arrangement can work." Hope flickered in Margaret's green eyes. "And if the town continues to make life difficult?" Cole's jaw tightened. "The town will learn to mind its manners, or they'll answer to me." Emma clapped her hands together. "A whole week? Can we have tea parties? Can you tell me about Ireland? Do you know any fairy stories?" Margaret laughed, and the sound was like silver bells in the cold air. "I know more fairy stories than you could hear in a year, little one, and I'd love to have tea parties with you." As they walked toward the boarding house, Emma skipping between them, chattering excitedly, Cole found himself stealing glances at Margaret. She moved with quiet dignity, despite what had just happened, her head held high, her responses to Emma's constant questions patient and warm. Maybe Emma was right. Maybe there were different kinds of beautiful, and maybe he'd been looking at the world through eyes that had forgotten how to see what truly mattered. Behind them, watching from the window of the general store, several townspeople observed the unlikely trio with curiosity and something that might have been the beginning of respect. Because if Sheriff Davidson's little girl had seen something special in the Irish woman, maybe there was more to her than met the eye. And in a small frontier town where survival often depended on looking beyond the surface, that was a lesson worth learning. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house sat on the corner of Main Street like a welcoming beacon, its yellow paint and white shutters offering a stark contrast to the cold reception Margaret had received at the train station. Ruth Henderson was a widow herself, a practical woman in her 50s who'd learned that survival in a frontier town meant judging people by their actions rather than their appearances. "Well now," Mrs. Henderson said as she opened the door, taking in the unusual trio on her porch, "you must be the young lady Sheriff Davidson's been expecting." Her eyes swept over Margaret without judgment, then settled on Emma, who was still clutching Margaret's hand like a lifeline. "Yes, ma'am," Margaret replied, her Irish accent soft but clear. "Margaret O'Brien, I was hoping you might have a room available for a week." "A week, is it?" Mrs. Henderson's knowing gaze flicked between Margaret and Cole. "Well, that's sensible. No point rushing into things." She stepped aside to let them in. "I've got a nice room upstairs, overlooks the garden. It'll be peaceful there." The boarding house was warm and welcoming, with lace curtains and the smell of fresh bread wafting from the kitchen. Emma immediately began exploring, her excited chatter echoing through the hallways as she pointed out pictures and furniture to Margaret. "She's taken quite a shine to you," Mrs. Henderson observed quietly as she and Margaret watched the little girl's enthusiasm. "She's a special child," Margaret replied. "She sees the world with such pure eyes." "That she does. Lost her mother young, poor thing. Been quiet as a church mouse ever since." Mrs. Henderson studied Margaret with keen eyes. "You seem to have brought some light back to her." Cole cleared his throat from the doorway. Miss O'Brien, if you're settled, I should get back to my duties. Emma, come along, let the lady rest. But Papa, Emma protested, can't we stay a little longer? I want to hear about the fairies in Ireland. Margaret knelt down to Emma's level. How about this, sweetheart? Tomorrow afternoon, if your papa says it's all right, you can come for tea and I'll tell you about the little people who live in the hills of County Cork. Emma's eyes went wide. Real fairies? As real as you and me, Margaret promised with a wink. That evening, Margaret sat alone in her room, looking out at the snow-covered town below. She'd unpacked her few belongings, including her mother's rosary and the bundle of letters from Cole that had convinced her to make this journey. Reading them again now, she could see the loneliness between the lines, the careful hope of a man who'd lost his wife and was trying to build something new for his daughter. The question was, could she be what he needed? What they both needed? A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Mrs. Henderson holding a tray of tea and fresh-baked biscuits. Thought you might be hungry, the older woman said, pushing past Margaret's protests and setting the tray on the small table by the window. And I figured you might want to talk to someone who's not carrying the weight of the whole town's expectations. Margaret smiled gratefully. You're very kind, Mrs. Henderson. Ruth, please. And kindness is just common sense. Ruth poured 2 cups of tea and settled into the chair across from Margaret. Now then, tell me what you're really thinking about all this. Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm cup, gathering her thoughts. I've been unwanted before, Ruth. More times than I care to count. Back in Ireland, the boys would court my friends and barely notice I was there. When I decided to answer Sheriff Davidson's advertisement, I knew I was taking a risk. But his letters were so... She paused, searching for the right words. Lonely, Ruth suggested gently. Yes, but also kind, intelligent. He wrote about Emma with such love, about wanting to give her a proper home with a mother's touch. I thought maybe, just maybe, he might see past. Margaret gestured vaguely at herself. Past what? The fact that you're a woman with curves instead of angles? That you take up space in the world instead of trying to disappear into the wallpaper? Margaret blinked in surprise at Ruth's bluntness. Oh, my dear girl, Ruth continued, you think being larger makes you less worthy of love? Let me tell you something about men in general and Cole Davidson in particular. The good ones, the ones worth having, they learn that a woman's size has nothing to do with the size of her heart. But the way the town looked at me today, the town's full of fools who've never been hungry enough to appreciate substance over style. Give them time. More importantly, give Cole time. Ruth leaned forward. That man's been living in a grave with his wife for 2 years. His daughter's the only thing that kept him breathing. But today, I saw something different in him when he looked at you. What did you see? Ruth smiled. I saw a man remembering that he's still alive. Meanwhile, across town at the sheriff's office, Cole was trying to focus on paperwork while Emma played quietly in the corner with her rag doll. But his mind kept wandering to green eyes and auburn hair and the way Margaret had knelt in the snow to comfort his daughter. Papa? Emma's voice broke through his thoughts. Yes, little bird. Are you going to marry Miss Margaret? Cole's pen stilled on the paper. I don't know, Emma. That's why we're giving it a week. To see if we suit each other. Emma was quiet for a moment, then said, Mama told me once that love isn't about what people look like on the outside. She said it's about what's in here. Emma pressed her small hand to her chest over her heart. Cole felt his throat tighten. Sarah had indeed said something like that, long ago when they were young, and everything seemed possible. Miss Margaret has a good heart, Emma continued with the absolute certainty of childhood. I can tell. And she smells nice, and she knows fairy stories, and she didn't get mad when those people were mean to her. That means she's strong, right? Yes, sweetheart. That means she's very strong. Then I think you should marry her. We need someone strong in our family. That night, Cole lay awake in his empty bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about strength. He'd always associated strength with his late wife's delicate endurance, her ability to face hardship without complaint. But Margaret had shown a different kind of strength today. The strength to face cruelty with dignity, to find joy in a child's acceptance, to offer hope where others saw only disappointment. The next morning brought fresh challenges. Cole was barely at his office when Mayor Whitman burst through the door, his face red with indignation. "Davidson, what in blazes were you thinking? Bringing that woman here?" Cole's hand moved instinctively to his gun belt. "Careful how you finish that sentence, Mayor. The town council's concerned. She's not what we expected for a sheriff's wife. People are talking." "Let them talk." Cole's voice was dangerously quiet. "Miss O'Brien is a guest in our town for 1 week. Anyone who can't extend basic hospitality to a guest can answer to me. But Cole, be reasonable. Your position in this community? My position is to keep the peace and uphold the law. And the law says a man has the right to court whoever he chooses without interference from busybodies and gossips." Mayor Whitman sputtered, but before he could respond, the office door opened and Emma skipped in, her face bright with excitement. "Papa, is it afternoon yet? Can we go see Miss Margaret for tea?" Cole checked his pocket watch. It was barely 10 in the morning, but Emma had clearly been counting every minute since waking up. "Not yet, little bird." "But soon." Mayor Whitman looked at Emma's eager face, then at Cole's protective stance, and seemed to deflate slightly. "Just think about what's best for everyone, Davidson. That's all I'm asking." After the mayor left, Cole lifted Emma onto his lap. "What do you want to ask Miss Margaret about today?" "Everything," Emma declared. "About Ireland and fairies, and if she ever met a real prince, and if she knows how to make Irish stew, and if she can teach me to talk like her, and—" "Whoa there, little bird," Cole laughed, and realized it was the first genuine laugh he'd had in months. "Save some questions for tomorrow." That afternoon, they made their way to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. Emma practically bounced with excitement, while Cole found himself nervous in a way he hadn't been since courting Sarah 20 years ago. Margaret was waiting for them in the parlor, looking lovely in a green dress that brought out her eyes. She'd arranged a proper tea service on the small table, complete with tiny sandwiches and cookies that made Emma gasp with delight. "A real tea party," Emma exclaimed, carefully settling into her chair and placing her napkin on her lap, just like her mother had taught her. As Margaret began telling stories of leprechauns and selkies, her lyrical voice filling the room with magic, Cole found himself watching not just his daughter's rapt attention, but the gentle way Margaret included him in her tales, the graceful movements of her hands, the genuine joy she took in Emma's wonder. Maybe Ruth Henderson was right. Maybe he was finally remembering that he was still alive. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what his heart needed to learn. The third day of Margaret's stay brought with it an unexpected crisis that would test not only her character, but the mettle of the entire town. It started with young Timothy Fletcher, the blacksmith's 8-year-old son, who came running into the sheriff's office with tears streaming down his face and his left arm hanging at an unnatural angle. "Sheriff Davidson," the boy cried, "Papa's trapped under the beam at the forge." It fell when he was moving the iron stock. Cole was on his feet instantly, grabbing his hat and medical supplies. "Emma, stay with Mrs. Patterson next door," he commanded, but Emma was already reaching for her coat. "I want to help too, Papa. This is no place for a little girl." "Then I'll go get Miss Margaret," Emma declared, running out the door before Cole could stop her. "She'll know what to do," Cole cursed under his breath, but had no time to chase after his daughter. Timothy Fletcher led him at a run toward the smithy, where they could already hear Tom Fletcher's agonized cries echoing from inside the smoke-filled building. By the time Cole reached the forge, a small crowd had gathered, but no one seemed to know what to do. Tom Fletcher was pinned beneath a massive oak beam that had snapped free from its supports, trapping him from the waist down. The man's face was gray with pain and shock, and there was blood seeping from somewhere beneath the timber. "We tried to lift it," Doc Henley said grimly as Cole assessed the situation. "Takes at least 6 strong men, and even then—" He shook his head. "I'm not sure moving it won't make things worse." "We have to do something," Cole growled. "He'll die if we leave him like this." That's when Margaret O'Brien appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath from running, with Emma close behind her. The crowd parted automatically, some with curiosity, others with poorly concealed skepticism. What could a fat Irish woman possibly do that the townsmen hadn't already tried? Margaret took one look at the situation and began rolling up her sleeves. Emma, dear, you stay right there by the door. Don't come any closer. Then she turned to the men standing around uselessly. I need 4 of you on that end of the beam, 2 on this side. Doc Henley, get ready to pull Mr. Fletcher clear the moment we lift. Ma'am, we already tried, one of the men began. You tried lifting straight up, Margaret interrupted, her voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone present. That beam's caught on the anvil base on one end. We need to pivot it, not lift it. My father was a stoneworker in Cork. I've seen this before. She positioned herself at what seemed like the worst possible spot, right next to where Tom Fletcher lay groaning. On my count, we lift and push toward the door. The fulcrum point is here. She placed her hands on the beam, her considerable weight and strength becoming assets rather than liabilities. Ma'am, Doc Henley said hesitantly, if this goes wrong, if we don't try, Mr. Fletcher dies, Margaret said simply. Now, gentlemen, on 3. 1, 2, 3. 6 people strained against the massive beam, but it was Margaret's understanding of leverage and her own surprising strength that made the difference. The beam groaned, shifted, and suddenly swung free. Doc Henley dragged Tom Fletcher clear just as the timber crashed down in the spot where he'd been trapped. The blacksmith was unconscious but breathing. Doc Henley immediately began examining his injuries while Margaret helped organize the men to carry him to the doctor's office. She worked with calm efficiency, directing the makeshift stretcher, checking to make sure Tom's airway was clear, even thinking to send someone to fetch his wife. It wasn't until Tom Fletcher was safely in Doc Henley's care that Margaret finally stopped moving, leaning against the wall of the smithy with exhaustion and delayed shock. Cole, who'd watched the entire rescue with growing amazement, approached her quietly. That was incredible, he said. How did you know what to do? Margaret shrugged as if saving a man's life was just another Tuesday activity. My father worked construction before the famine took the jobs away. I helped him sometimes when I was young. You learn about weight and balance when your family's livelihood depends on moving heavy things safely. Emma ran to Margaret and wrapped her arms around the woman's waist. You saved him! You're a hero! Oh, no, sweetheart, Margaret said, smoothing Emma's hair. We all saved him together. That's what people do in a real community. They help each other. Word of the rescue spread through Pine Ridge like wildfire. By evening, the story had grown in the telling, but the essential facts remained the same. The Irish woman had stepped up when others hesitated, had known what to do when the townsmen were stumped, and had quite possibly saved Tom Fletcher's life. Mrs. Abernathy, who'd been among the most vocal critics of Margaret's presence in town, found herself in the uncomfortable position of having to publicly acknowledge what had happened. Well, she said to her sewing circle that evening, her voice stiff with reluctant admission, I suppose we must credit Miss O'Brien with resourcefulness. Resourcefulness? Snorted Martha Collins, the general store owner's wife. The woman saved Tom Fletcher's life, while the rest of us stood around wringing our hands. That's not resourcefulness. That's courage. Even Mayor Whitman found his opposition to Margaret's presence somewhat undermined when Tom Fletcher's wife, Mary, publicly thanked the brave Irish lady who brought my husband home to me. But it was the conversation in Cole's kitchen that evening that mattered most. Emma was already in bed, exhausted by the day's excitement, and Cole was sharing a cup of coffee with Margaret while she helped him understand what exactly had happened at the smithy. You could have been hurt, he said quietly, if that beam had shifted the wrong way. But it didn't, Margaret replied, and Mr. Fletcher is alive because we took the risk. Cole studied her face in the lamplight. There was no false modesty there, no fishing for compliments. She'd done what needed doing and moved on, as if heroism was simply part of her nature. You're not what I expected, he said finally. Margaret's smile was sad but not bitter. I'm rarely what people expect, Sheriff Davidson. The question is whether that disappoints you or surprises you in a good way. Cole was quiet for a long moment, thinking about his late wife, Sarah. Sarah had been everything a frontier wife was supposed to be: delicate, dependent, grateful for protection. She'd needed him to take care of her, to shield her from the harsher realities of frontier life. Margaret O'Brien clearly needed no such protection. She was the kind of woman who ran toward danger instead of away from it, who saw problems as puzzles to be solved rather than obstacles to be endured. She was strong in ways he was only beginning to understand. "It surprises me," he admitted, "in the best possible way." Margaret's smile this time was warm and genuine. "I'm glad, because there's something I need to tell you about why I really came here." Cole felt his stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" "I mean the letters we exchanged. They were wonderful. But they weren't the only reason I answered your advertisement." Margaret wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, gathering her courage. "Back in Ireland, there was a man, Patrick Murphy. There was an understanding between us. His family owned the farm next to ours." Cole waited, sensing there was more to the story. "When the potato blight got worse and my father lost his work, Patrick's family decided I wasn't a suitable match anymore. They said they needed someone who could bring money to the marriage, not more mouths to feed." Margaret's voice was steady, but Cole could hear the old pain underneath. "Patrick didn't fight for me, didn't even say goodbye." "I'm sorry," Cole said, meaning it. "The point is, I didn't come here just looking for a husband. I came here looking for someone who might value me for what I could give, not just what I look like or what I could bring in terms of money or status." She met his eyes directly. "I came looking for someone who might actually want me, not just settle for me." Cole reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Margaret O'Brien, after what I saw today, after watching you with Emma, after seeing the kind of woman you really are, any man who didn't fight for you was a fool." Outside, the first flakes of fresh snow began to fall, but inside Cole's kitchen, something warm and precious was beginning to bloom. It would take time to fully grow, and there would be more challenges ahead, but the foundation was being laid for something real and lasting. Something that had nothing to do with appearances and everything to do with the true measure of a person's heart. The fifth day of Margaret's week-long trial brought an unexpected visitor to Pine Ridge, one who would test not only Margaret's resolve, but Cole's commitment to looking beyond the surface of things. The morning stage brought with it a woman who stepped down onto the platform like she was gracing a royal court instead of a dusty frontier town. Victoria Ashford was everything Margaret O'Brien was not. Tall, slender, elegant, with golden hair piled high beneath a fashionable hat and a traveling dress that probably cost more than most people in Pine Ridge made in a year. She moved with the confident grace of someone who'd never been told she was too much of anything. And when she smiled, it was with the practiced charm of a woman accustomed to getting her way. Cole was in his office when Mayor Whitman burst in, practically glowing with excitement. "Davidson, you'll never guess who just arrived on the morning stage. Victoria Ashford. You remember Senator Ashford's daughter from Denver? She's come specifically to meet you." Cole looked up from his paperwork with a frown. "Meet me? Why?" "Apparently word of your situation with the Irish woman reached certain circles in Denver. Miss Ashford's father thinks you're making a mistake that could hurt your political prospects. She's come to offer herself as a more suitable alternative." The implications hit Cole like a physical blow. "Political prospects? I'm a small-town sheriff, not a politician." "But you could be more." Mayor Whitman's eyes gleamed with ambition. "Senator Ashford has connections, influence. A marriage to his daughter could open doors you've never even imagined. Governor, maybe even Congress someday." Cole stood up slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun belt. A habit when he was angry. "And what about Emma? What about what I want? Think of Emma's future. Think of the opportunities she'd have with the Ashford name behind her." Mayor Whitman was practically vibrating with excitement. "Miss Ashford is waiting at the hotel. She'd like to meet you for lunch." Meanwhile, across town at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, Margaret was helping Ruth prepare lunch when they heard the commotion outside. Through the window, they could see townspeople gathering around an elegant carriage, craning their necks to get a look at the refined lady who'd just taken rooms at the hotel. "Well now," Ruth murmured, "that's interesting timing." Margaret's stomach sank as she watched Victoria Ashford glide through the hotel entrance. Every inch the perfect lady. She's beautiful, Margaret said quietly. She's polished, Ruth corrected. There's a difference. But Margaret had seen the way some of the townspeople looked at Victoria, then glanced toward the boarding house with expressions that clearly said, "Now this is what a sheriff's wife should look like." Emma burst through the front door at that moment, her face flushed with excitement from running. "Miss Margaret, there's a fancy lady at the hotel and Mrs. Patterson says she came to marry Papa. But Papa can't marry her because he's going to marry you, right?" Margaret knelt down to Emma's level, her heart breaking at the confusion in the little girl's eyes. "Sweetheart, your papa hasn't decided anything yet. We're still getting to know each other, remember?" "But I don't want to get to know the fancy lady," Emma said with the stubborn logic of childhood. "I want you to be my mama." Before Margaret could respond, the boarding house door opened again, and Cole stepped inside. His face was grim, and Margaret could see the conflict written in every line of his expression. "Margaret, we need to talk," he said quietly. Ruth immediately took Emma's hand. "Come on, little one. Let's go see if the chickens laid any eggs this morning." When they were alone, Cole sat heavily in one of Ruth's parlor chairs, running his hands through his hair. "There's a woman at the hotel. Victoria Ashford. She's everything a man in my position is supposed to want." Margaret felt her heart sink, but she kept her voice steady. "And do you want her?" "I don't know her," Cole said honestly, "but everyone in town thinks I should. The mayor, the town council, probably half the citizens of Pine Ridge. She's refined, educated, connected. She could give Emma opportunities I never dreamed of." "But," Margaret prompted, sensing there was more. Cole looked up at her with tortured eyes. "But when I think about marrying her, all I can picture is a life of pretending to be someone I'm not. Of dinner parties and political events and conversations about things that don't matter to me." He stood up and began pacing. "And when I think about you, what do you think about when you think about me?" Cole stopped pacing and looked at her directly. "I think about Emma laughing at your stories. I think about how you saved Tom Fletcher's life without a second thought. I think about sitting in my kitchen drinking coffee and talking about things that actually matter." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I think about being happy." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but she forced herself to be practical. "Happiness isn't always enough, Cole. Emma deserves every opportunity in life. If this woman can give her things, I can't." "Stop." Cole crossed the room and took her hands in his. "Margaret, look at me." She reluctantly raised her eyes to his. 3 days ago, my daughter was a quiet, withdrawn little girl who barely spoke except when spoken to. Since you've been here, she's been laughing, asking questions, excited about life again. What opportunity could be more valuable than having a mother who brings joy back into her world? "But the town can go to hell," Cole said with sudden vehemence. "I've spent 2 years living for other people's expectations, trying to be the perfect widower, the perfect sheriff, the perfect everything. And you know what it got me? A life that felt like a prison and a daughter who was disappearing more each day." Margaret's hands trembled in his. "Cole, I know we've only had a few days together. I know this is crazy and impractical and probably a dozen kinds of foolish. But Margaret O'Brien, you've made me remember what it feels like to be alive. And more than that, you've given my daughter back her smile. How do I walk away from that?" Before Margaret could answer, the parlor door flew open and Emma ran in, tears streaming down her face, and Ruth close behind her, looking distressed. "Papa," Emma sobbed, throwing herself into Cole's arms. "Mrs. Patterson says the fancy lady is going to take you away, and I'll never see Miss Margaret again." Cole lifted his daughter and held her close, his jaw clenching with anger at the busybodies who'd upset her. "Emma, listen to me. No one is taking me anywhere I don't want to go." "But what if you want to go with her because she's prettier and fancier, and I'm not good enough to be her daughter?" The words hit Cole like a punch to the gut. He sat down with Emma still in his arms and looked directly into her tear-filled eyes. "Emma Davidson, you listen to me very carefully. You are perfect exactly as you are. Any woman who wouldn't consider herself lucky to be your mother isn't worth knowing. Do you understand me?" Emma nodded, hiccuping slightly. "Good. Now there's something I need to tell you." Cole glanced at Margaret, then back at his daughter. I've been thinking about this very carefully, and I've made a decision. Margaret held her breath. If Miss Margaret is willing, I'd very much like to ask her to marry me. Not because it's practical or expected or politically useful, but because she makes us both happy, and happiness is the most important thing a family can have. Emma's face lit up like sunrise. Really, Papa? Really and truly? Really and truly? Cole looked at Margaret over Emma's head. That is, if she'll have us. Margaret felt her heart swell until she thought it might burst. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, of course I'll have you. Both of you. Emma launched herself from her father's arms into Margaret's, and for a moment the three of them held each other in a circle of warmth and belonging that felt more real than anything Margaret had ever experienced. But their joy was interrupted by a sharp knock at the boarding house door. Ruth went to answer it and returned with a grim expression. It's Miss Ashford, she said quietly. She'd like to speak with you, Sheriff Davidson. She says it's a matter of some urgency. Cole's face hardened. Tell her I'll be there directly. As he stood to go, Margaret caught his hand. Cole, are you sure about this? Really sure? Because once you turn her down, there's no going back. No political connections, no opportunities, no... Cole silenced her with a kiss that was gentle but firm, full of certainty and promise. When he pulled away, his eyes were clear and determined. Margaret O'Brien, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. The only opportunity I care about is the chance to build a real life with you and Emma. As he walked toward the door, Emma tugged on Margaret's skirt. Miss Margaret, are you going to be my mama for real? Margaret knelt down and pulled the little girl close. If you'll have me, sweetheart, forever and always. Even when I'm naughty, especially when you're naughty. Emma grinned and hugged her tight. This is going to be the best family ever. Outside, Cole straightened his shoulders and prepared to face Victoria Ashford. He had no idea what she would say or how she would react to his decision, but for the first time in years, he was making a choice based on love instead of obligation, and that made all the difference. Victoria Ashford was waiting in the hotel parlor like a queen holding court, her posture perfect and her smile practiced. She'd arranged herself artfully on the velvet settee, her traveling dress spread just so, one gloved hand resting elegantly on her reticule. Everything about her spoke of money, breeding, and the kind of effortless sophistication that opened doors in polite society. Cole Davidson stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene. 3 months ago, 3 weeks ago, he might have been impressed. Victoria was undeniably beautiful, undeniably refined, undeniably everything a successful man was supposed to want in a wife. Now all he could think about was how cold the room felt despite the blazing fire, how her smile never quite reached her eyes, how different she was from Margaret's warm laughter and genuine kindness. Sheriff Davidson, Victoria said, rising gracefully to greet him, how wonderful to finally meet you in person. I've heard so much about you. Miss Ashford. Cole removed his hat but remained standing. I understand you've come a long way to speak with me. Victoria's laugh was like silver bells, pretty but somehow hollow. I have indeed. May I be frank with you, Sheriff? I'd prefer it. My father sent me here because he believes you're about to make a serious mistake, one that could damage not only your own future, but your daughter's as well. Victoria moved closer, her perfume filling the space between them. I've come to offer you an alternative. Cole's jaw tightened. I'm listening. Marry me instead. The words were delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never been refused anything in her life. Think about it rationally, Sheriff. I can give you connections in Denver, in Washington. I can open doors for your political career that would otherwise remain forever closed. Your daughter would have access to the finest schools, the best society, opportunities that a frontier sheriff could never provide on his own. And what would you get out of this arrangement? Victoria's smile became more calculating. A respectable husband with potential, a chance to be a pioneer woman without actually having to endure the unpleasantness of true frontier life. My father would ensure your appointment to higher office within 2 years. Cole studied her beautiful cold face. And Emma? What would you expect from her? She would need to learn proper deportment, of course, her speech patterns corrected, her mannerisms refined. She's young enough to be molded into something appropriate for our social circle. Victoria waved a dismissive hand. Children adapt quickly when given proper guidance. Something dangerous flickered in Cole's eyes. Molded into something appropriate? Well, yes, you can hardly expect to move in refined circles with a child who speaks like a frontier waif. But don't worry, I have experience with such things. My cousin's children were quite rough when they came to live with us after their parents died. Within a year, you could hardly tell they hadn't been raised in proper society from birth. Cole took a step back, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun belt. Not in threat, but in the way of a man trying to keep his temper in check. Miss Ashford, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Victoria's perfect eyebrows rose slightly. Oh, my daughter doesn't need to be molded into anything. She's perfect exactly as she is. And any woman who can't see that has no business being her mother. Victoria's smile faltered slightly. Sheriff Davidson, surely you understand. I understand perfectly. Cole's voice was deadly quiet. You see Emma as a project to be improved rather than a child to be loved. You see me as a stepping stone to social advancement rather than a man with his own mind and heart. And you see this town as something to be escaped from rather than a community worth serving. But the opportunities I care about are the chance to watch my daughter grow up happy and confident, the chance to build something real with someone who loves us both for who we are, and the chance to serve this community to the best of my ability. Cole put his hat back on his head. I'm sorry you came all this way for nothing, Miss Ashford, but I won't be needing your alternative. Victoria's composed mask slipped for the first time, revealing something sharp and ugly beneath. You're making a mistake, Sheriff. That Irish woman is fat, common, completely unsuitable for a man of your position. People will laugh at you behind your back. Let them laugh. Cole's voice was steel wrapped in silk. I'd rather be laughed at for choosing love than pitied for choosing ambition. Your daughter will suffer for this decision. She'll be branded as the child of a fool who threw away every advantage for the sake of sentiment. Cole's eyes blazed. My daughter will be raised by a woman who sees her as a blessing, not a burden. By a woman who saved a man's life without thinking twice about it, who faces cruelty with dignity, who brings joy wherever she goes. If that makes me a fool, then I'm proud to be one. Victoria stood frozen for a moment, clearly not accustomed to being refused so definitively. You'll regret this, Sheriff Davidson. When your career stagnates, when doors close instead of opening, when your daughter grows up without the advantages I could have provided, you'll remember this conversation. I'm sure I will, Cole said calmly, and I'll be grateful I had the sense to choose happiness over advantage. As Cole left the hotel, word of the confrontation spread through Pine Ridge like wildfire. By evening, the entire town knew that their sheriff had turned down Senator Ashford's daughter in favor of the Irish mail-order bride, and opinions were sharply divided. In the barber shop, old Pete Wilson was holding court. Man's got a right to marry who he chooses. Politics be damned. That O'Brien woman saved Tom Fletcher's life. That counts for something in my book. But at the ladies' sewing circle, Mrs. Abernathy was expressing a different view. It's all very well to be sentimental, but practical considerations must be taken into account. The sheriff has a responsibility to his position in this community. The debate might have continued indefinitely if not for an unexpected intervention. Tom Fletcher, still weak from his injuries but determined to be heard, made his way to the church that evening, where most of the town had gathered for the weekly social. I'd like to say something, he announced, leaning heavily on his crutches. The room fell silent. Week ago, some of you were ready to judge a woman based on nothing but her appearance. Today, some of you are ready to judge our sheriff based on his choice of bride. Tom's voice gained strength as he continued. But I'm alive tonight because Margaret O'Brien saw a problem and solved it. Not because she was trying to impress anyone or gain anything for herself, but because it was the right thing to do. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of his neighbors and friends. I've lived in this town for 20 years. I've seen fancy people come and go, talking about refinement in society and proper behavior. But when the chips were down, when I was dying under that beam, it wasn't refinement that saved me. It was courage. It was kindness. It was a woman who cared more about doing right than looking right. Tom straightened as much as his injuries allowed. Sheriff Davidson is a good man who deserves to be happy. His little girl is lucky to have a woman like Margaret O'Brien willing to love her. And if this town is too small-minded to see that, then maybe we're the ones who need to do some changing. The silence that followed was profound. Even Mrs. Abernathy seemed to have nothing to say. It was Mary Fletcher who spoke next, rising from her seat with tears in her eyes. Tom's right. Miss O'Brien gave me back my husband. She gave my children back their father. How can I judge a woman like that for anything as foolish as the size of her dress? One by one, other voices joined in. Doc Henley admitted he'd been impressed by Margaret's quick thinking under pressure. Martha Collins mentioned how polite and helpful Margaret had been at the general store. Even Mayor Whitman, faced with the united opinion of his constituents, grudgingly admitted that perhaps the sheriff's choice deserves more consideration than I initially gave it. By the end of the evening, the tide of opinion had turned decisively in Margaret's favor, not because she was beautiful in the conventional sense, but because she had proven herself to be beautiful in ways that truly mattered. The next morning, Victoria Ashford departed Pine Ridge on the early stage, her mission a complete failure. She left behind a town that had learned something important about the difference between surface polish and genuine worth. And in the sheriff's office, Cole Davidson sat at his desk with a smile on his face, knowing that in 3 days' time, he would be marrying the woman he loved, with the blessing of his daughter and the acceptance of his community. Sometimes, Cole reflected, the best decisions were the ones that felt right in your heart, regardless of what anyone else thought was proper or practical. Sometimes love really was enough. 3 days later, the morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, with fresh snow covering Pine Ridge like a blessing. The wooden church at the end of Main Street had never looked more welcoming, its bell tower reaching toward a sky so blue it seemed painted by angels themselves. Inside Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, Margaret O'Brien sat before the mirror in her room, hardly believing this day had finally come. Ruth Henderson bustled around behind her, putting the finishing touches on the wedding dress they'd worked on together for the past 2 days. Margaret's own blue traveling dress, transformed with new lace and careful alterations into something worthy of the most important day of her life. "You look radiant, dear," Ruth said, fastening a simple strand of pearls around Margaret's neck. Her own mother's pearls, saved for just such an occasion. Absolutely radiant. Margaret studied her reflection with wonder. She was still the same plus-size woman who'd stepped off the train a week ago, still the same person who'd faced mockery and judgment. But something had changed in her eyes. There was a light there now, a confidence born of being truly loved and accepted for exactly who she was. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and Emma's voice called out, "Miss Margaret, can I come in?" "Of course, sweetheart." Emma bounded into the room wearing her own new dress, a soft green wool that brought out her eyes with ribbons Ruth had helped her weave into her blonde curls. But it was what she carried that made Margaret's breath catch. "Papa said I should give you this," Emma said shyly, holding out a small bouquet of winter roses, greenhouse flowers that must have cost Cole a week's salary. "He says every bride should have flowers, and these are almost as pretty as you are." Margaret knelt down to Emma's level, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "They're beautiful, Emma. Just like you. Are you really going to be my mama today? If you'll have me..." Emma threw her arms around Margaret's neck. "I've been waiting my whole life for you to come. I just didn't know it until you got here." Meanwhile, across town at the sheriff's office, Cole Davidson was struggling with his necktie, while Mayor Whitman offered unwanted assistance and commentary. "You could still change your mind," the mayor said for the 3rd time that morning. "Miss Ashford is probably still in Denver. A telegram could..." "Whitman," Cole interrupted, "if you mention that woman's name one more time, I'm going to forget we're friends and remember I carry a gun." Doc Henley, who was serving as Cole's best man, chuckled from his position by the window. "Leave the man alone, Mayor. I haven't seen him this happy since before Sarah died. That's worth more than all the political connections in the world." Cole finally got his tie situated and reached for his coat, his best black wool, brushed clean and pressed for the occasion. Is Tom Fletcher going to be able to make it? Wouldn't miss it, Doc Henley confirmed. Mary's got him in a wheelchair, but he insisted on being there. Says he owes Miss Margaret his life, and the least he can do is witness her happiness. As the church bells began to ring, calling the town to witness the wedding, people emerged from their homes and businesses, bundled against the cold, but eager to be part of the celebration. The past week had changed Pine Ridge in ways both large and small. They'd learned that beauty came in many forms, that courage could be found in unexpected places, and that love was worth more than social standing. Mrs. Abernathy appeared on the church steps, looking surprisingly cheerful for someone who'd opposed the marriage just days before. "Sheriff Davidson," she called out as Cole approached, "I wanted you to know that the Ladies' Auxiliary has prepared a proper reception at the church hall. Nothing fancy, mind you, but, well, every bride deserves a celebration." Cole tipped his hat to her, genuinely touched. "That's very kind of you, ma'am. Margaret will be pleased." Inside the church, the pews were filling with townspeople who'd come not out of obligation, but out of genuine goodwill. Pete Wilson from the barber shop sat next to Martha Collins from the general store. The Fletcher family occupied an entire pew, with Tom in his wheelchair at the end, looking pale but determined. Even some of the rougher men from the saloons had cleaned up and come to pay their respects. Reverend Matthews took his place at the altar, his usually stern face softened by the joy of the occasion. He'd married dozens of couples over the years, but there was something special about this one, a sense that he was witnessing not just the union of two people, but the healing of a community's heart. The church door opened, and Ruth Henderson entered, taking her place at the piano. The simple melody she began to play wasn't fancy or sophisticated, but it was warm and welcoming, like Margaret herself. Then Emma appeared at the back of the church, walking slowly down the aisle with a basket of rose petals, her face glowing with pride and happiness. She scattered the flowers with careful precision, wanting everything to be perfect for her soon-to-be mother. Cole's breath caught in his throat when Margaret appeared in the doorway. She wasn't the conventional bride. She was something better. She was real, substantial, glowing with inner beauty that no amount of artifice could match. The blue dress became her perfectly, and the simple veil framed her face like a blessing. But it was her smile that truly took his breath away. Radiant, joyful, full of love for him and for the life they were about to build together. As Margaret walked down the aisle, something remarkable happened. The whispers and murmurs that often accompanied such occasions were replaced by genuine warmth. People smiled as she passed, nodding in approval and welcome. Mrs. Fletcher reached out to touch her hand as she went by. Doc Henley wiped away what might have been a tear. When Margaret reached the altar, Cole stepped forward to meet her, taking her hands in his. The simple gesture sent a ripple of approval through the congregation. Here was a man who was proud to claim this woman as his bride. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Matthews began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Cole Davidson and Margaret O'Brien in holy matrimony. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, with respect and love for one another." As the familiar words washed over them, Cole and Margaret looked into each other's eyes and saw their future written there. Not perfect, perhaps, but real and lasting, and built on something solid. "Do you, Cole Davidson, take Margaret O'Brien to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" Cole's voice was strong and clear. "I do. And do you, Margaret O'Brien, take Cole Davidson to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? Margaret's Irish accent made the words sound like music. I do. Emma, standing beside them as the flower girl, clapped her hands softly and whispered, Now we're a real family. The congregation chuckled at her enthusiasm, and even Reverend Matthews smiled before continuing with the ceremony. When it came time for the rings, Emma proudly presented them on a small silk pillow. Simple gold bands that Cole had ordered specially from Denver, inscribed with their initials and the date. By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Reverend Matthews closed his Bible with satisfaction. Cole, you may kiss your bride. The kiss was gentle but full of promise, witnessed by a church full of people who'd learned that real love was worth celebrating, regardless of what package it came in. As they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, the church erupted in applause and cheers. Emma threw her arms around both of them, creating a perfect family portrait that would live in the memory of everyone present. The reception at the church hall was everything Mrs. Abernathy had promised. Simple but heartfelt, with food prepared by the women of the town and music provided by anyone who could play an instrument. Margaret was surprised and touched by how many people approached her with genuine congratulations and welcome to the community. You know, Tom Fletcher said as Mary wheeled him over to the newlyweds, I never properly thanked you for saving my life. No thanks necessary, Margaret replied. Anyone would have done the same. No, Tom said seriously, not everyone would have. But you did without thinking twice about it. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of woman you are. As the evening wore on, Cole and Margaret found themselves on the dance floor, moving slowly to a simple waltz played by Ruth Henderson on her violin. Margaret had worried she might be too heavy, too awkward, too much for such a public display. But in Cole's arms, she felt graceful and beloved. No regrets? She asked softly as they swayed together. Cole looked down at her face, lit by the warm glow of the lanterns, surrounded by friends and family who'd come to celebrate their love. Only one, he said. Margaret's heart skipped. What's that? That it took me so long to find you. Later that night, as they tucked Emma into her bed in what was now their home, the little girl looked up at them with sleepy contentment. Mama Margaret, she said, trying out the name, will you tell me an Irish story? Every night if you like, Margaret promised, smoothing Emma's hair. And Papa, will you still read to me sometimes too? Every night, Cole assured her. As they kissed Emma goodnight and left her room together, Cole and Margaret looked at each other with wonder. They were a family now, not the conventional kind perhaps, but the best kind, built on love, acceptance, and the courage to see beauty in unexpected places. Outside, fresh snow was beginning to fall again, covering Pine Ridge in pristine white. But inside their home, warmth and love glowed like a beacon, proving that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the most unlikely beginnings. And they all lived beautifully ever after. Not because life was perfect, but because they'd learned that perfect wasn't necessary when you had love, acceptance, and the wisdom to see with your heart instead of just your eyes. And that's how Margaret O'Brien, a plus-size Irish woman who was mocked and rejected for her appearance, became the most beloved woman in Pine Ridge, Colorado. Not because she changed who she was, but because she showed an entire town what real beauty looked like. Think about that for a moment. Margaret never lost a single pound. She never became conventionally prettier. She never transformed into the kind of woman that society told her she needed to be. Instead, she simply lived her life with courage, kindness, and authenticity, and in doing so, she changed everyone around her. Little Emma Davidson saw it first, with the pure, uncomplicated vision that only children possess. She looked at Margaret and saw beauty because she wasn't looking with prejudiced eyes. She was looking with her heart. And sometimes it takes a child's honesty to remind adults what we've forgotten about seeing the world clearly. Sheriff Cole Davidson learned something profound during that week-long trial period. He discovered that the woman who looked perfect on paper, Victoria Ashford with her money, connections, and conventional beauty, would have given him a life of pretense and political calculation. Meanwhile, the woman who seemed all wrong for his position Margaret, with her size, her foreign accent, her lack of social standing, offered him something infinitely more valuable: genuine love, authentic partnership, and a mother who would cherish his daughter exactly as she was. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was that of Pine Ridge itself. A community that began by judging a woman based purely on her appearance ended up learning one of life's most important lessons: that true worth has nothing to do with the size of your dress and everything to do with the size of your heart. Margaret's heroic rescue of Tom Fletcher didn't happen because she was trying to prove herself worthy. It happened because that's who she was: someone who saw a problem and acted to solve it, regardless of the risk to herself. That kind of courage, that instinctive compassion, that willingness to put others before yourself, those are the qualities that make someone truly beautiful. And what about Emma? That precious little girl who'd been quietly disappearing into herself after losing her mother found her voice again through Margaret's love. She learned that families aren't just made through blood, but through choice, commitment, and the daily decision to love someone unconditionally. This story reminds us of something we often forget in our image-obsessed world: that the most attractive quality anyone can possess is the courage to be authentically themselves, regardless of what others might think. Margaret could have tried to hide who she was, could have apologized for taking up space in the world, could have made herself smaller to fit into other people's expectations. Instead, she chose to live boldly, love deeply, and trust that the right people would see her true value. The fairy tale ending isn't that Margaret became thin and conventionally beautiful. The fairy tale ending is that she found people who loved her exactly as she was, and a community that learned to value character over appearance, substance over style, and heart over everything else. How many of us have felt like Margaret, standing on that train platform while cruel voices whispered their judgments? How many times have we been made to feel that we weren't enough? Not pretty enough, not thin enough, not young enough, not perfect enough to deserve real love and acceptance? Margaret's story tells us that those voices are wrong, dead wrong, that every single one of us deserves to be loved for who we truly are, not who we think we need to become to be worthy of love. But this story also challenges us to examine our own hearts. Are we like the townspeople who initially judged Margaret by her appearance? Do we sometimes let superficial considerations blind us to the real beauty that surrounds us? Do we teach our children, consciously or unconsciously, that worth is measured by looks rather than character? Emma Davidson saw beauty where adults saw flaws because she hadn't yet learned to judge people by society's narrow standards. She saw Margaret's kindness, her gentle strength, her capacity for love, and those were the things that mattered to a child's honest heart. What would our world look like if we all learned to see through Emma's eyes? If we valued courage over conformity, kindness over appearance, authenticity over artifice? Margaret and Cole's love story suggests that when we have the courage to look beyond the surface, we often find treasures we never expected to discover. The real villain in this story wasn't Victoria Ashford. She was simply a product of a society that taught her to value connections over character. The real villain was prejudice itself, the poison that makes us judge people before we know them, that blinds us to the beauty that exists in infinite variety. And the real heroes? They were the people who learned to see differently. Tom Fletcher, whose near-death experience taught him to value the courage that saved his life over the appearance of his rescuer. Doc Henley, who recognized skill and quick thinking regardless of who possessed them. Ruth Henderson, who understood from the beginning that a person's size says nothing about their heart. And ultimately, even Mrs. Abernathy and Mayor Whitman, who had the grace to admit when they were wrong and the wisdom to change. But most of all, the heroes were Cole, Margaret, and Emma. Three people who chose love over convention, authenticity over approval, and happiness over status. They created a family based not on what looked right to the outside world, but on what felt right in their hearts. Their story reminds us that real love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone whose imperfections complement your own. Someone who makes you laugh. Someone who stands beside you when life gets difficult. Someone who sees the best in you even when you can't see it yourself. Margaret O'Brien Davidson never became the woman society told her she should be. Instead, she became something better, herself, fully and completely, loved and cherished for exactly who she was. What did you think of Margaret and Cole's journey from judgment to love, from prejudice to acceptance? Could you see yourself having the courage to choose authenticity over approval the way they did? Have you ever experienced the kind of unconditional acceptance that Emma offered Margaret from the very first moment they met? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing how these frontier tales of courage and love inspire you. And if this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that beauty comes in all shapes and sizes, make sure to hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. If you enjoyed this tale of finding love and acceptance against all odds, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Stories and ring that notification bell. We've got more incredible adventures coming your way, including the story of a female doctor who fought to prove herself in a man's world, and a tale of two rival ranchers whose children fell in love despite their family's feud. These are the stories that build America. Tales of ordinary people who found extraordinary courage when they needed it most, who chose love over fear, and who proved that the human heart is always big enough for one more chance at happiness. Remember, you are beautiful exactly as you are, worthy of love exactly as you are, and deserving of happiness exactly as you are. Don't let anyone, not society, not cruel voices, not even your own inner critic, convince you otherwise. Thanks for taking this emotional journey with us, partner. Until next time, keep your hearts open and remember that the most beautiful stories often begin with the most unexpected beginnings. Like this video if you believe in the power of true love, and subscribe for more legendary frontier stories that prove the human spirit can overcome anything.